My landlord tried to evict me without notice so he could rent my apartment for double the price. I took photos, sent them to the city, and reported every violation. 3 months later, the building was condemned. When I found the eviction notice taped to my apartment door on a Tuesday morning in March, I thought there had been some kind of mistake. According to the official-looking document, I had 30 days to vacate the premises due to lease violations that were never specified in detail. The notice claimed I had been consistently late with rent payments and had damaged property beyond normal wear and tear, both of which were completely false accusations that made my blood boil as I read them. I had been living in my one-bedroom apartment for almost 2 years and had never been late with a single rent payment. I kept meticulous records of all my transactions, including money order receipts and bank statements showing exactly when rent was paid each month. I was the type of tenant who paid on the first of every month like clockwork, sometimes even a few days early when I got paid on Fridays. The apartment was also in excellent condition because I took pride in maintaining my living space and had even made minor improvements at my own expense, including new cabinet hardware and a fresh coat of paint in the bedroom. My landlord Vincent owned a 4-story brick building with 16 units total, and I paid $850 monthly for a one-bedroom apartment that was small but clean and conveniently located near downtown. The rent was reasonable for the area, which should have been my first clue that Vincent was looking for ways to increase his rental income from the building. Most similar apartments in the neighborhood were going for at least $1,200 to $1,300, so I knew I had a good deal that was probably too good to last forever. Vincent was a heavy-set man in his 50s who drove an expensive luxury car and always wore gold jewelry that suggested he was doing well financially from his real estate investments. He owned several rental properties throughout the city and had a reputation among tenants for being difficult to deal with when it came to repairs and maintenance issues. I had heard stories from other renters about Vincent ignoring problems and threatening eviction when people complained too much about building conditions. When I called Vincent to discuss the eviction notice and ask about the alleged lease violations, his response was dismissive and aggressive in a way that caught me completely off guard. He claimed that I knew exactly what I had done wrong and that he was being generous by giving me 30 days instead of demanding immediate departure. His tone was hostile and condescending, like he was talking to a child who had been caught misbehaving. When I pressed him for specific details about the supposed violations, he became even more hostile and told me to find somewhere else to live because he had plans for my apartment. He mentioned that the rental market was hot and that he could easily find tenants who would appreciate living in the building and would not cause problems like I apparently had been causing. That conversation made it clear that Vincent was trying to force me out illegally so he could re-rent my apartment at a much higher price. The rental market in our city had become increasingly competitive over the past year, with housing costs rising dramatically as more young professionals moved to the area for tech jobs. Similar apartments in the building were now listing for $1,500 to $1,600 monthly, and some of the renovated units were going for even more than that. Vincent apparently saw an opportunity to nearly double his rental income from my unit by getting rid of a long-term tenant with a below-market lease. I immediately researched tenant rights laws in my state and discovered that Vincent's eviction notice was completely invalid for multiple reasons. First, he had not provided the required 60-day notice for month-to-month tenancies, and second, he had failed to specify actual lease violations that would justify eviction proceedings. Most importantly, attempting to evict a tenant solely to increase rent was explicitly prohibited under local rent stabilization ordinances that had been passed to protect long-term residents from displacement. The more I researched, the angrier I became about Vincent's blatant disregard for the law and his assumption that I would simply accept his illegal eviction notice without fighting back. I was not the type of person to roll over when someone tried to take advantage of me, especially when they were clearly in the wrong and breaking multiple housing laws in the process. Armed with this knowledge, I contacted the local tenant rights organization and spoke with a counselor named Maria who specialized in helping renters deal with illegal eviction attempts. Maria was a passionate advocate who had been fighting for tenant rights for over 15 years and had seen every trick that unscrupulous landlords use to exploit their tenants. She reviewed my lease agreement and the fraudulent eviction notice and confirmed that Vincent was clearly violating multiple housing laws in his attempt to force me out of my apartment. Maria advised me to document everything related to Vincent's illegal eviction attempt and to start paying close attention to other potential violations of housing codes and tenant protection laws in the building. She explained that landlords who were willing to break eviction laws were often cutting corners in other areas that could provide grounds for legal action or regulatory intervention. Her advice was to become a detective in my own building and start noticing things that I might have previously overlooked or dismissed as normal wear and tear. That advice turned out to be more valuable than I initially realized. Over the next few days, I started paying attention to building conditions and maintenance issues that I had previously overlooked or dismissed as minor inconveniences. What I discovered was a systematic pattern of neglect and code violations that put every tenant in the building at risk and revealed Vincent's true character as a slumlord who prioritized profits over tenant safety. The most obvious problems were in the common areas where Vincent had clearly been deferring maintenance to maximize his profits. The main entrance door had a broken lock that had not worked properly for months, allowing anyone to enter the building without being buzzed in by residents. This created a serious security issue since strangers could access the building at any time, but Vincent had ignored multiple tenant complaints about the problem. The lobby lighting consisted of a single flickering fluorescent bulb that provided inadequate illumination, especially during evening hours when residents were returning from work. The light fixture itself was hanging at an odd angle, suggesting that it had been damaged and poorly repaired rather than properly replaced. The lobby also had water stains on the ceiling that indicated ongoing leaks from the apartments above, but Vincent had simply painted over the stains rather than addressing the underlying plumbing problems. The stairwells were even worse, with loose handrails that wobbled dangerously when touched and several steps that had developed cracks and uneven surfaces that created serious tripping hazards. The carpeting on the stairs was worn through in several places, exposing the underlying wood and creating additional safety risks. I had always been careful going up and down the stairs, but I had never really thought about how dangerous the conditions were until I started looking at them through the lens of housing code violations. The fire exits were partially blocked by storage items that Vincent had placed in the hallways, including old furniture and boxes of what appeared to be building supplies. Some of the emergency lighting had burned out bulbs that had never been replaced, and several exit signs were either missing or so faded that they would be useless during an actual emergency. The fire extinguishers mounted on the walls had not been inspected in over 2 years according to the dates on their tags. My own apartment had issues that I had learned to work around, but now realized were serious safety violations that could potentially cause injuries or property damage. The electrical outlets in my kitchen sparked occasionally when I plugged in appliances, suggesting faulty wiring that could potentially cause fires. I had gotten into the habit of being very careful when using certain outlets, but I now understood that this was not normal and represented a significant fire hazard. The bathroom ventilation fan had not worked since I moved in 2 years earlier, creating moisture problems that were beginning to cause mold growth around the window frame and in the corner where the shower met the wall. The lack of proper ventilation was also causing paint to peel and creating an environment where dangerous mold could flourish and affect the air quality in my apartment. The heating system was another major concern since my radiators provided uneven heat and made loud banging noises throughout the night during winter months. Several other tenants had complained about similar heating problems, but Vincent consistently ignored requests for repairs and told people to use space heaters if they were cold. The radiators in my apartment would sometimes get so hot they were dangerous to touch, while other times they provided no heat at all, forcing me to layer clothing and use blankets during cold weather. The windows in my apartment had several panes of glass that were cracked, and the frames were so old and warped that they did not close properly, creating drafts that made heating costs higher and allowed moisture to enter the apartment. The window locks were broken, which created both security and safety issues since the windows could not be properly secured. Most alarming was what I discovered when I started investigating the basement and mechanical areas of the building. I had never paid much attention to these areas before, but I realized they were accessible to tenants, and I had every right to inspect common areas of the building where I lived. The boiler room had exposed electrical wiring and water damage that suggested ongoing leaks from old plumbing. The electrical panel looked like it had not been updated in decades and had several circuits that were clearly overloaded with extension cords and temporary wiring. The basement itself had a strong, musty odor that indicated possible mold or sewage problems that could affect air quality throughout the entire building. There were several areas where water was clearly seeping through the foundation walls, creating puddles on the concrete floor and contributing to the moisture problems that were causing mold growth throughout the building. I also discovered that Vincent had been storing various chemicals and maintenance supplies in the basement without proper ventilation or safety precautions. There were open containers of paint thinner, cleaning solvents, and other hazardous materials that created fire and health risks for everyone in the building. The storage area was not properly separated from the heating equipment, which violated basic fire safety codes. I began systematically documenting every code violation and safety hazard I could identify, taking detailed photographs with my smartphone and keeping written records of dates and conditions. I created a spreadsheet to track all the problems I found and organized them by category so I could report them to the appropriate city departments. I also started taking photos of the same problems on different days to show that they were ongoing issues rather than temporary situations. I also started talking to other tenants about their experiences with building maintenance and learned that Vincent had a pattern of ignoring repair requests and threatening eviction when people complained too persistently about problems. These conversations revealed that my situation was not unique and that Vincent had been systematically neglecting his responsibilities as a landlord while collecting rent from tenants who were living in substandard and potentially dangerous conditions. My neighbor Sarah, who lived in the apartment next to mine, told me that her bathroom ceiling had been leaking for 6 months and Vincent refused to fix the problem despite multiple written requests. The leak had caused visible water damage and was beginning to create mold growth that was affecting her health with respiratory problems and headaches. Vincent claimed the repairs were too expensive and suggested she move out if she was not satisfied with the conditions. Sarah had young children and was worried about the health effects of the mold, but she could not afford to move and lose her security deposit. Another tenant named Carlos, who lived on the second floor, explained that his apartment had a severe rodent infestation that Vincent refused to address professionally. Instead of hiring a licensed exterminator, Vincent had given Carlos some cheap traps from the hardware store and told him to deal with the problem himself. The mice were coming through holes in the walls that connected to other units, so the infestation was spreading throughout the building and affecting multiple apartments. Carlos had been living with the problem for over a year and was frustrated by Vincent's refusal to take proper action. Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman who lived on the first floor, told me about problems with her heating that were even worse than mine. Her radiators had not worked properly for 2 winters, and Vincent's solution was to give her a small space heater that was not adequate to heat her entire apartment. Mrs. Henderson was on a fixed income and could not afford the electric bills that resulted from using space heaters, so she had been living in a cold apartment and had developed health problems that she attributed to the poor living conditions. These conversations with other tenants revealed that Vincent was not just trying to illegally evict me, but was systematically neglecting his responsibilities as a landlord while collecting rent from tenants who were living in substandard and potentially dangerous conditions. I realized that my illegal eviction notice was just one symptom of a much larger pattern of exploitation and neglect that was affecting every tenant in the building. I also learned that several tenants had tried to organize complaints against Vincent in the past, but their efforts had been unsuccessful because they did not know how to effectively navigate the city bureaucracy or document violations in ways that would trigger serious enforcement action. Most people had given up after making 1 or 2 phone calls to city departments and not seeing immediate results. This information motivated me to take a more systematic and strategic approach to addressing Vincent's violations. I decided to become an expert on housing codes and tenant rights so I could file complaints that would be taken seriously by city officials and would result in meaningful enforcement action. I spent hours researching municipal codes and regulations, reading city websites, and learning about the different departments that had jurisdiction over various aspects of rental housing. I decided to take comprehensive action against Vincent's violations by filing complaints with every relevant city department and regulatory agency. I started with the Housing Authority and submitted a detailed report with photographs documenting all the code violations and safety hazards I had identified throughout the building. I included a spreadsheet listing each violation with the specific code section that was being violated and photographs showing the current conditions. The housing inspector who responded to my complaint was clearly shocked by the extent of the problems in Vincent's building. Inspector Johnson was a veteran city employee who had seen his share of problem properties, but he told me that the number and severity of violations in Vincent's building were among the worst he had encountered in his 15-year career. During her initial visit, she identified dozens of additional violations that I had not even noticed, including improper smoke detector installations, inadequate emergency exits, and structural issues that required immediate attention from qualified professionals. Inspector Johnson explained that many of the violations I had documented were serious enough to warrant immediate action, and some were so dangerous that they created imminent threats to tenant safety. She was particularly concerned about the electrical problems and the blocked fire exits, which could result in serious injuries or deaths if there was an emergency in the building. I also filed complaints with the fire department about the blocked emergency exits and faulty electrical systems. Fire Marshal Davis conducted his own inspection and found numerous fire code violations that required immediate correction. He was especially concerned about the improper storage of flammable materials in the basement and the overloaded electrical circuits that created significant fire risks. The health department received my complaint about the mold and possible sewage problems, and environmental health specialist Rodriguez conducted air quality testing that confirmed dangerous levels of mold spores throughout the building. She also identified several other health hazards, including lead paint in the common areas and possible asbestos in the ceiling tiles of older apartments. The building inspector received my complaint about structural concerns and maintenance violations, and structural engineer Thompson found serious foundation problems and water damage that had compromised the integrity of load-bearing walls. His report indicated that some of the structural issues were so severe that they could potentially cause partial building collapse if not addressed immediately. Each agency opened its own investigation and scheduled follow-up inspections to document the specific violations under their jurisdiction. The coordination between different city departments was impressive, and I learned that they had protocols for handling cases where multiple agencies identified serious violations in the same property. The response from city officials was swift and comprehensive. Within 2 weeks of my initial complaints, Vincent received violation notices from 4 different municipal departments requiring immediate corrections to dozens of safety and maintenance issues. The violations carried significant fines that started at $500 per violation and increased dramatically for repeat offenses or failures to comply with correction deadlines. The housing authority violations alone totaled over $25,000 in potential fines, and that did not include the penalties from the fire department, health department, and building inspector. Vincent was facing financial consequences that would cost him far more than he could possibly gain by illegally evicting me and raising my rent. Vincent's reaction to the city inspections was predictably hostile and defensive. He called me multiple times to accuse me of causing trouble and costing him money through frivolous complaints. His voice was angry and threatening as he accused me of being a vindictive tenant who was trying to destroy his business because I was upset about the eviction notice. He threatened to pursue the illegal eviction more aggressively and warned me that I would regret making enemies with someone who had connections in the real estate industry. Vincent claimed that he could make it difficult for me to find housing elsewhere and that other landlords would not want to rent to someone who caused problems for property owners. These threats only motivated me to document his retaliation attempts and file additional complaints about landlord harassment and intimidation tactics. The tenant rights organization helped me prepare a comprehensive response that included copies of Vincent's threatening voicemails and text messages along with evidence of his continued attempts to force me out illegally despite the pending city investigations. Meanwhile, the city inspections were revealing problems that were even more serious than anyone had initially realized. The structural engineer who examined the building found significant foundation issues and water damage that had compromised the integrity of load-bearing walls in ways that could potentially cause catastrophic failure. The electrical inspector discovered wiring violations that created immediate fire hazards and required emergency repairs by licensed professionals. Most damaging to Vincent's position was the discovery that he had been operating several apartment units without proper permits and had made unauthorized modifications to the building that violated zoning regulations and safety codes. These violations had apparently been ongoing for years, but Vincent had avoided detection by not reporting problems and discouraging tenants from filing complaints with city agencies. The investigation revealed that Vincent had illegally subdivided 2 apartments into smaller units to increase his rental income, which violated both zoning laws and fire safety codes. The subdivided units did not have proper emergency exits and shared electrical and plumbing systems in ways that created serious safety hazards for the tenants living in them. Vincent had also installed security cameras in common areas without proper permits and had been recording tenants without their knowledge or consent, which violated privacy laws and city surveillance regulations. The camera system was improperly wired and connected to electrical circuits that were already overloaded, creating additional fire risks. The accumulation of violations and the severity of the structural and safety problems led to an escalating series of enforcement actions by multiple city departments. Vincent was required to hire licensed contractors to address the most serious violations within 30 days, and failure to comply would result in additional fines and potential legal action by the city attorney's office. The city also issued stop work orders that prohibited Vincent from making any changes to the building until all violations were corrected and properly inspected. This meant he could not renovate apartments or make improvements that might increase rental income until he had addressed the fundamental safety and code compliance issues. Vincent attempted to address some of the violations by hiring the cheapest contractors he could find, but many of the repairs were done improperly and failed follow-up inspections. The electrical work was particularly problematic since the contractor he hired was not properly licensed for the type of complex rewiring that was required to bring the building up to current safety standards. The city inspectors were not satisfied with the substandard repair work and issued additional violations for improper installation and failure to obtain required permits. Vincent's attempts to cut corners and avoid spending money on quality repairs were actually making his legal situation worse and resulting in even more fines and penalties. As the deadline for compliance approached, it became clear that Vincent either could not or would not invest the money necessary to properly address all the violations that had been identified. The cost estimates for bringing the building into full compliance with housing and safety codes exceeded $100,000, which apparently was more than Vincent was willing or able to spend on a building that he had been neglecting for years. The violations were so extensive and serious that city officials began discussing the possibility of condemning the building if Vincent failed to make the required corrections. The health department was particularly concerned about the mold problems and air quality issues that were affecting tenant health, while the fire department was worried about the immediate safety risks created by blocked exits and faulty electrical systems. 3 months after I filed my initial complaints, I received a notice from the City Housing Authority that Vincent's building had been declared uninhabitable due to multiple unresolved safety violations and structural problems. All tenants were given 60 days to relocate with assistance from the city's emergency housing program, and the building would be condemned if the violations were not corrected within that time frame. The condemnation notice was delivered to every tenant in the building along with information about their rights and available resources for finding alternative housing. The city also posted large notices on the building entrance warning potential visitors about the unsafe conditions and prohibiting new leases or rentals until all violations were corrected. The condemnation process moved quickly once Vincent made it clear that he had no intention of making the required repairs. Rather than invest in bringing the building up to code, he chose to abandon the property and walk away from his responsibilities as a landlord. Vincent apparently decided that the cost of repairs was too high compared to the potential rental income, so he was willing to lose the building rather than spend money on tenant safety. The city took possession of the building through eminent domain proceedings and began the legal process of condemning it as a public safety hazard. All tenants were required to vacate within the 60-day deadline, and the building was scheduled to be demolished once it was confirmed that all residents had found alternative housing. I felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness when the building was officially condemned and boarded up. While I was vindicated in my complaints about Vincent's illegal eviction attempt and negligent management, I was also losing my affordable apartment and facing the challenge of finding new housing in an increasingly expensive rental market. The irony was not lost on me that Vincent's greed and illegal eviction attempt had ultimately resulted in him losing the entire building and all his rental income from the property. However, the tenant rights organization helped me and the other displaced tenants file a class action lawsuit against Vincent for the costs and damages related to our forced relocation. The lawsuit sought compensation for moving expenses, security deposits on new apartments, temporary housing costs, and the difference in rent costs that resulted from having to find housing quickly in a tight rental market. The legal proceedings revealed that Vincent owned several other rental properties with similar patterns of neglect and tenant exploitation. Our lawsuit encouraged tenants from his other buildings to come forward with their own complaints, leading to additional investigations and enforcement actions by city agencies that ultimately affected hundreds of tenants across multiple properties. Vincent's other properties were also found to have serious code violations and safety problems, suggesting that his neglect of my building was not an isolated incident, but part of a systematic business model based on extracting maximum profits while minimizing maintenance and safety investments. The city began comprehensive inspections of all his properties and found similar patterns of violations that required extensive correction efforts. Vincent eventually settled the class action lawsuit rather than face a lengthy court battle that would have exposed even more evidence of his systematic violations of housing laws and tenant rights. The settlement provided significant compensation for all the tenants who had been displaced from the condemned building and helped cover the costs of relocating to safe and legal housing. The settlement also included provisions requiring Vincent to sell his remaining rental properties to buyers who agreed to bring them into full compliance with housing codes and safety regulations. This effectively ended Vincent's career as a landlord and prevented him from continuing to exploit tenants in substandard housing conditions. Most importantly, the investigation of Vincent's properties led to changes in how the city monitored rental housing and responded to tenant complaints. The Housing Authority implemented new inspection protocols that required annual safety inspections for older buildings and increased penalties for landlords who failed to maintain safe and habitable conditions for their tenants. The city also created a new online system that allowed tenants to report violations and track the status of their complaints, making it easier for residents to hold landlords accountable for maintaining their properties properly. The system included a database of violation history for rental properties that potential tenants could access when considering where to live. Looking back, I realized that Vincent's illegal eviction attempt was actually a blessing in disguise because it motivated me to investigate and expose dangerous conditions that were putting multiple families at risk. If he had not tried to force me out, I might never have paid attention to the serious safety violations that eventually led to the building being condemned and other tenants being protected from continued exploitation. The experience taught me valuable lessons about tenant rights and the importance of standing up to exploitation by unscrupulous landlords who prioritize profits over the safety and well-being of their tenants. It also demonstrated the power of documentation and systematic reporting to appropriate authorities when dealing with violations of housing laws and tenant protection regulations. I learned that individual tenants have more power than they realize when they understand their rights and know how to effectively navigate city bureaucracy to report violations and demand enforcement action. The key is to be systematic, persistent, and well-documented in approaching these problems rather than making random complaints that are easy for officials to ignore or dismiss. Today I live in a much better apartment with a responsible landlord who maintains the property properly and respects tenant rights. The monthly rent is higher than what I was paying Vincent, but the peace of mind that comes from living in safe and legal housing is worth the additional cost. My new apartment has proper heating, working electrical systems, and a landlord who responds promptly to maintenance requests and treats tenants with respect. The condemned building where I used to live still sits empty with boards over the windows and doors, serving as a reminder of what happens when landlords neglect their responsibilities and try to exploit tenants who know their rights and are willing to fight for them. The empty building has become a symbol in the neighborhood of the consequences that await slumlords who put profits ahead of tenant safety and legal compliance. The experience also connected me with other tenant advocates and helped me become more involved in housing rights issues in my community. I now volunteer with the tenant rights organization that helped me and assist other renters who are dealing with similar problems with unscrupulous landlords who violate housing laws and exploit vulnerable tenants. Vincent's attempt to illegally evict me ultimately backfired in ways he never could have imagined and cost him far more than he ever could have gained by doubling my rent. His greed and willingness to break the law led to the loss of his entire rental portfolio and legal consequences that will follow him for years to come.